Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our February Promising Practices webinar, Transforming City Charter Processes Through Democratic Innovation. My name is Rebecca Trout, and I'm the director of the National Civic League's All-America City Award, as well as our DC office. Before we dive into today's subject matter, I just want to give you a little bit of background on the National Civic League. For those of you a little bit less familiar with the League, we are a national nonpartisan nonprofit. We advance inclusive civic engagement as well as promote innovations in democracy that strive to make it more decision-making more participatory, equitable, and effective. We were actually founded way back in 1894 by a group of reformists led by Teddy Roosevelt and Louis Brandeis. That makes us the oldest good governance organization in the country. We really championed several of the democracy innovations of the earliest 20th century, and we think we're positioned to do so again now. We do this primarily through three categories of work: community assistance, awards and events, and our research and publications. A few of the things that you might know come from the League. We maintain the Model City Charter, which we'll dive into a little bit more today. Of course, organize the All-America City Award. We publish the National Civic Review, as well as support a national network of civic leaders. We'll be joined by two members of our Center for Democracy Innovation today. They work with public officials in the U.S. to understand, test, and disseminate the next generation of civic innovations. And many of these innovations that we highlight in these webinars they end up being featured in the All-America City Award projects as well as our journal. I would be a bad program director if I did not take every opportunity to plug the All-America City Award. The All-America City Award, we're in our 76th year. We recognize communities that are using civic engagement and collaboration to solve challenges as well as seize opportunities. We have a different theme each year. This year, we're going to be focused on recognizing communities who are strengthening environmental sustainability through community engagement and collaboration. I won't read through this full list of potential projects, but these are some ideas of what we think communities are doing around this topic. And if you were doing any of these things, you might consider applying this year. You'll notice on your screen there's some important dates. Applications are due right around the corner, March 6th. So if you have not begun working on that and are interested in applying, you should start on that soon. I'm actually hosting the final open office hours tomorrow. So if you have any questions and you're still considering applying but aren't entirely sure about the criteria or anything like that, we'll have some opportunity tomorrow to speak if you're interested. But now I'd like to hand it over to our speakers for the day. We are joined by a really great group of individuals, city charter experts and historians who are going to provide insights into the legacy and evolution of the Model City Charter, as well as local democracy innovators and practitioners who are going to share their experience with participatory processes and platforms and how that might be integrated into either a charter itself or a charter revision process. So first up from the League, we'll be hearing from Derek Akubo. He's the director of our Civic Assistance Program at the National Civic League. He leads our efforts to help communities integrate engagement practices into their processes, including strategic planning, issue-specific initiatives, and charter reviews. Next up, we'll be joined by today's webinar mastermind, Nick Vlahos. He's the Deputy Director of the Center for Democracy Innovation. He spearheads transformative projects such as our deliberative study sessions, which integrate elected officials with randomly selected residents into city council forums. And he is also helping us to map the national network of healthy democracy ecosystem. After they give us some background information, we're going to be joined by a very experienced panel led by Margaret Stout, Anna Karen Corning, and then our very own Matt Leininger. Margaret is the Professor Emerita at West Virginia University. Dr. Stout is internationally recognized for theoretical contributions to the field of public administration and governance studies. She's joining us in part to discuss the ideas featured in her NCR article, Repurposing Citizen Advisory Bodies in the 9th Model City Charter. Many of her contributions actually informed the most recent revision of the Model City Charter. She's consulted on 2 charter revisions, one from town hall governance to a council manager charter, and one to retain a council manager charter rather than switching to a strong mayor governance. And then Anna is a public policy professional. She specializes in democratic innovation, urban governance, and civic engagement. She has extensive experience working with municipal governments, nonprofits, and research institutions. She played a really key role in Cambridge, Massachusetts' recent charter review, which we'll talk a little bit about today. And I think most of you are going to know or recognize Matt Leininger. He is our director of the Center for Democracy Innovation. He leads the center's work to strengthen democratic infrastructure, organizes national engagement efforts, and measures the quality of engagement and democracy. And before I handle it off to them, just a couple of boring housekeeping items real quick. I ask that you please remain muted to cut back on background noise out of respect for our speakers and panelists. We will be interacting with you during the panel discussion. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to put those in the chat. It looks like it's already a lively place. So if you'd like to introduce yourself or have any comments that you'd like to start us off with, please go ahead and insert those there. And then never fear if you forget anything or missed anything. We are recording this webinar. The recording as well as slides will be emailed to you either later today or early tomorrow. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Derek Akubo. Derek?
Thank you, Rebecca. Good afternoon, everybody. It's really a pleasure for me to be here. I'm going to provide some background on the how the Model City Charter was formed, our 9th edition, and then a typical charter revision process. The first slide here, or next slide there, Rebecca. So as Rebecca mentioned in her introduction, the National Municipal League was formed as a result of a convening in 1894 by a bunch of civic reformers, community reformers of that time period. They brought people together to the National Conference on Good City Government during a time when corruption, patronage, inefficiencies with local government were really prominent, and there was a lot of concern. So they convened this conference, and out of that conference, the National Municipal League was formed to address those concerns that were brought up at the conference. As a result of that convening, in 1900, the National Municipal League released the first Model City Charter as a means to take on that corruption and make government more effective and efficient and accountable to its residents. The charter provided a standardized framework and structure to improve the responsiveness of government, accountability, transparency, and participation with its residents. As a way to address that corruption was the professionalization of local government, where the council manager form was introduced. A key thing with that new form was that the powers were separated, where a professional manager was hired to keep house while the elected officials were out in the community leading. That really addressed what the hope was that addressed the area concerns of corruption and patronage that were so prominent at that time. During the 20s and 30s, that was when the League really helped implement the form throughout the country and advocated for home rule, where self-governance was emphasized, which helped with more efficiency at the local level. Let's go to the next slide. So the Model City Charter, as I mentioned, was first introduced in 1900, and it has gone through 9 revisions through the years. In 2021, city managers, the National Civic League convened city managers, our partner organizations like ICMA and NLC, National League of Cities, to city managers, elected officials, academics, community organizations were all a part of this revision process. And the most significant updates were in 3 areas: social equity, for the purpose of better representing the community internally within government among staff and being effective with service delivery externally to all residents and parts of the community. The second area was expanding public engagement to become more impactful with collaborative problem solving and addressing complex community issues. And the third area was enhancing performance with the form, the council manager form, and things as simple as recommending annual evaluations of the city manager, and then also emphasizing more as far as how the city manager worked with, communicates with city council, and also other areas such as introducing and advocating for wards and districts, elections, and how they were implemented in the community. Let's go to the last slide here. So what this slide covers is what I would call a typical process for revising city charters. And this outline is also very much a part of our guide for charter commissions that the National Civic League has put out. And the framework that I'm describing can be very different from place to place because state and local laws on revising city charters can really vary. So one of the first steps that we would always emphasize is that to check to see what the state and local laws and requirements are for revising the charters and work with that. We recommend that the charter be reviewed every 10 years. Although the charter, when things come up, can be reviewed before that. But as a standard, every 10 years would be a recommendation. With this typical process is a city council would appoint a charter commission. The charter commission would study the existing charter. They would engage with the community on what changes they would recommend. Also talk with staff and council to identify those areas of review. The commission would then work on those areas for change, keeping in mind the intent and desired outcome that they would like to see from that change. And the commission and the legal staff would work together on the language that would go into the charter. The commission would provide a report to city council on the changes and why. The council would review and hopefully approve those changes based on the charter commission. And then a standard step would be that the changes would then go to public vote for approval. That is what a typical charter revision process would go through. And again, it could vary from locale to locale.
Thanks, Derek. Appreciate that. Okay, I am following some chats about some difficulty seeing slides. I just stopped sharing and started sharing again. Can you all see if that is working? I'm getting some nods, some no's, several nods. So for those of you not seeing slides, can you try changing your viewpoint? If not, I will be sharing these slides after the course of the webinar. So we'll go forth as is, and then hopefully you can review the slides later. And I want to hand it off to Nick now.
Awesome.
Rebecca, can I just say really quickly, there's two options depending on how updated your Zoom is. One is either standard and the other is speaker. And people who are using one of those are able to see the slides.
Thanks
Great.
for that.
Right. So building on what Derek has said, Civic League, we've been actively interested for a long time in charter review processes. And what we're thinking about at the Center for Democracy Innovation, also with our colleagues who should be on the call here, Civic Genius, is thinking about different ways that we might utilize, and even others on the call as well, how to utilize democratic innovation in charter review processes. Recently, and this is part this conversation here that's about to take place is heavily inspired by a recent NCR article that I co-wrote with excellent co-authors, David Schechter at Democracy R&D and Lynn Davis at Healthy Democracy. And so we'll share that link with you if you want to read the article there. But I will also say that the next few slides aren't going to be an in-depth conversation about citizens assemblies. We do have a Citizens Assembly 101 webinar, and we can share that either in the chat or in the follow-up slides. So we do break down citizen assemblies a little bit more in depth. We also have a conversation about the 9th edition of the Model City Charter as well that talks a lot about Article 7, which talks about embedding civic engagement. So there's two other webinars for your interests. So building on this, how might we think about transforming city charters through democratic innovation? And one way that we think about this is through citizens assemblies. Rebecca, when you get a chance to put up the next slide, you can do that. So from one way to start thinking about this is, what are the challenges with traditional charter review? And I want to suggest that not every city is going to want to do a citizens assembly. So there's a lot of interesting ways that you might want to embed public engagement in your existing city charter process. But if we want to think about, taking this to the next step of what we're thinking about in terms of democracy innovation, what are some of the challenges? Rebecca, next slide, if you can, please. Thanks. So one of the things that happens is the political influence. Now, this might not necessarily be a problem, but some might view this as the tendency for there to be a level of political influence in determining who's becoming part of the commission. So it might be appointed by the city council or often by the mayor, for example. There might be some challenges with limited public participation because there is a tendency often for the types of engagement to be a public hearing model where you have 3 minutes at a microphone. And this really does vary also because a lot of commissioners might be coming from the general public, and it might vary depending on the type of experience they have and the resources at their capacity to be able to host different types of meetings and formats and facilitated activities. Another one building on that is possibly the lack of deliberation and learning about the technicalities of the specific format of governance and different opportunities that you might want to embed. There might not be enough structured conversation around learning about the different sorts of experiences that happen within your own community and abroad. And then another challenge could be potentially legitimacy and trust issues. If the process does come to be heavily viewed as heavily controlled by specific political interests, the public might have, some challenges with that process. And at the end of the day, this does have to also go to a public referendum. You want to think about the through line here about whether or not you can gain community buy-in to this process. Next slide, if you can, please. So very, very quickly, I just want to suggest that, there are a few ways that charters are initiated. There are different forms that they take. There are different ways that they're ratified. So it might happen where that legislation is through periodic review. It's embedded in the charter. A legislative body like a city council might convene it, or a citizen initiative review. A citizen initiative might trigger that review, and that happens in some places that might interest some people, that you can trigger a charter revision process through a citizen initiative. Now, the forms that it might take is that the citizens might then, if they initiate it through an initiative, they might form their own charter commission. A mayor might, or council might select commissioners. And for us here, that we're emphasizing here is that the possibility for a democracy innovation is a real possibility, and it is something that you should strongly consider if you have the time and the resources to back that up. And then, of course, there's the ratification of this. This might go to a referendum. It might go through council modification, or it might go to a special act through the state legislature. So we're going to hone in here on specifically on a citizens assembly model. If you can change the slide, please. So before we jump into the phases that we suggest here, I think it's good to sort of just take a step back and have a perspective of why we might want to do this. And so there's a real opportunity here through a city charter review process to revitalize and update democracy. Like, how often do you get a chance to work on a local constitution? How, and think about it in terms of that, and how possibly exciting that really is. You have an opportunity to reduce political influence in commissioner selection, which is a real opportunity here to think about removing the possible legitimacy and trust issues you have. You have an opportunity here to think about better representation from the community as part and embedded within the actual commission itself, and then also how they provide input. And then thinking about the ways that you have reasoned conversation, thinking about weighing the pros and cons of specific formats of governance and having, structured conversation around that. And then thinking about how overall, we do hear about public apathy and democratic deficits and lack of public trust. Here's an opportunity to do something different and to rebuild it. And, the research does back this up, specifically on citizens' assemblies. There's a significant amount of research that supports that citizens' assemblies do create an internal level of political efficacy within the participants. They become more inclined to support specific issues. They become more inclined to support public officials. Why not try to translate this into a charter commission? Next slide, please. So I'm just going to quickly run through the next few slides about what we think of as a possible model, and then I really want to open this up to the panel conversation. So at root is selecting the process through civic lottery, and what we mean by a citizens' assembly really is taking a broad cross section of the community, putting them through various phases. Number one, of learning about a subject, deliberating with their peers about a subject, and then coming up with balanced recommendations on the specific subject. And so in this case, this would be, what are the contents of a charter review process? So we want to do a civic lottery, and then from here, think about making a very visible and public facing process open to the public. Here are the stages of what this would look like. We want there to be some form of influence on the agenda. We want there to be some form of charter education. We want to crowdsource the public's opinions. We want to draft and revise the charter, support a referendum so that it's successful, and then think about evaluation, because we want to have an understanding of how to make these better in the future. And the only way to do that is to evaluate them. So next slide. So a big thing here is that in all charter reviews, in the one we're proposing and in just any other general charter review process, the community engagement portion is a very significant part of the process. You want to have a broad array of people involved in the community, and it's important to think about how you get people from diverse backgrounds to be able to participate in this. And so after we've created a charter review commission in this model, which is through random selection and civic lottery based off of demographic characteristics, we want also the broader community to be part of this process and to submit their own ideas into the charter. So how might we want to do that? We want to think about possibly creating online portals. We want possibly to have people submit emails. We also want to have community meetings and forums. So how can the community make suggestions that are well thought out and think about the different variations of spaces that they might be able to actually submit those? Next slide, please. And then we're going to also have opportunities to learn. And so one of the strengths of the Citizens Assembly model is the learning component. A significant phase where you have experts that are from a variety of backgrounds, legal, political, bureaucratic, different political perspectives, that give presentations that people get to learn from and then consider how to make the best judgment on the different sorts of issues that they want to weigh. And so in this way, you might have possible public forums with in-person presentations, online video resources that are recorded so that they can be viewed asynchronously, and then ultimately facilitated roundtable discussions with possible commissioners. Next slide, please. And so, once you've had the opportunity to learn about subjects, you've gathered a variety of input. Now we want to start, weighing and balancing the pros and cons of the different sorts of material that you're considering to be included in your charter. And so the process here is that you don't strictly want to have a public hearing model. We suggest that there are limitations to having the public hearing model going up to a microphone with 3 minutes. We're suggesting to have more detailed conversations around this, and you might be able to have more detailed conversations using digital platforms like PollIS or Decidim. But at the end of the day, the commission, which is a diverse set of individuals, are going to basically come up with a priority of that they want to recommend. Next slide. And so in the drafting of the charter revision, what we're hoping here is that we're going to have a more thorough, well built-in feedback system where there has been a lot of public input into the process, and the structured conversations are going to lead to a far more nuanced conversation around what needs to be included in the next charter. And so generally what happens in a citizens assembly model is it goes beyond just a simple majority vote on a thing. They try to strive for a qualified consensus. You're not necessarily aiming for consensus, but you're having for sort of qualified conversations around the specific subjects. And each sort of idea that you want to propose for the charter has a clear rationale for why you did it. And that's going to become part of a public report. Next slide, please. So once this has happened, you've had the opportunity to produce a report. We also want to think about two other things, which is the post stages, the referenda. And, we know that there is a lot of challenges around misinformation and confusion and campaign spending. So we might also want to think about how you provide a very clear voter-friendly explanation of proposed charter changes with a detailed participatory process that includes how detailed this participatory process was, so you can get buy-in from the community. Next slide, please. And then post-evaluation methods. We're really striving towards achieving some sort of metrics, and we want to understand how successful these processes are. So I think it's important, even within a citizens only model or beyond. Like if you were running a charter review process, think about evaluating that process and having some form of public input. We have one process that we've been utilizing in city council meetings, which we call a civic engagement scorecard. You might want to think about post-evaluation surveys and things like that. And then of course, reporting out on this process so you can provide the lessons learned for other people to sort of learn from this and make this a better experience. And then the last slide, please. And I'm not going to touch too much upon this because I'm going to leave this for the panelists. But we also want to think about it's one thing to think about, good processes, but what about the content we put in the charter? How might we want to expand the conversation beyond city manager versus elected mayor? Why don't we start thinking about mandating deliberation and participation, different forms of authority and deliberative bodies that might be part of that process? Let's expand the thoughts about that. So from here, let's turn over to our panel conversation. So I want to welcome the distinguished panelists, and I want to encourage everyone in the chat to provide their own experiences as answer to these questions as well. So I'm curious from the panel, and there's no particular order here, but after hearing the sort of idea, what your thoughts are on using a citizens assembly model to guide the charter review process. How do you think communities would respond to this approach? What sort of considerations do you think we need to take into account?
I'm happy to kick off if Anna wants. Okay, I see nods. That's good. Well, I think that given the formality of charter review and revision, I think the citizens' assemblies are a really good form of public engagement. They're procedurally very rigorous, in this pursuit of representation that truly reflects the community's demographics. And I think you used the term sortition, and that's a fancy word, but it's using a lottery to get the right people at the table. But you also have to, know that we're assuming that participants' needs are adequately met so that they can sustain their engagement. And we all know that certain demographics find engagement in this sort of voluntary action very difficult. So that's, just sort of a caveat that we have to always think about with assemblies. But they have been shown to be very effective in achieving that representativeness. So I do think that they're better than a purely voluntary self-selection approach. And I noticed, in some of the comments, people are like, "Yeah, but what if people don't participate?" So, this approach has proven to be more successful on that front. And I've been involved with a couple of charter reviews that were purely voluntary self-selection, and the engagement wasn't strong. Um, that said, though, I think that we have to, really attend to what Nick was talking about in terms of the process itself. Once you get people at the table or into the room, there has to be excellence in terms of the process. And so, communities need to have the expertise facilitating dialogue and deliberation toward consensus, because the recommendations, whether it's the assembly is empowered to actually decide or just make recommendations to the appropriate legislative body, they need help. They need help getting there. So even a perfectly representative group that you can get through sortition needs that excellent process facilitation as well to get where they need to go. So those are my thoughts about this particular tool for this purpose.
That's excellent.
Thanks, Nick. I'll just chime in. I agree with everything that Margaret was saying. It's a really interesting idea and a way to get a more representative, diverse group to participate in these processes. But I think one key challenge that we see within charter review processes on the commissions themselves, even when people are volunteering or applying to be on these commissions, is that charters are somewhat of a foreign concept for most people. And so kind of that ramp up period and education for the commissions is really important. And so when we consider a sortition model for creating these commissions, how do we make sure that education and ramp up is there to make sure these people are informed and aware of kind of what the charter is, why it's important, and so that they're able to get into those meatier discussions on policies and the eventual recommendations. And I think even just informing people about what citizen assemblies are in the first place, and that prior work to kind of spread information about this is going to be happening, this is why it's important, and if you get selected, this is why you should do it. In addition to what Margaret said about making sure, maybe people are getting stipends and there's childcare provided and technology or translation services offered to make sure that everyone, we're creating an environment where those diverse and representative individuals are able to fully participate in these processes. But yeah.
Perfect. And so, we can sort of think about this as the sort of parallel process, think about it as a parallel process of a citizens assembly model, but then moving to embedding civic engagement within the charter, I think is a really interesting thought process of how we can actually expand democratic practices. So let's shift to the content itself. What are the sorts of institutional mechanisms that you think should be updated to strengthen civic engagement? And we might even think about renovating existing civic infrastructure. How and why might a charter reform lead to revamped advisory boards? Margaret, you might be able to talk about that, or council
Yeah.
meetings, Matt.
Yeah, I think that the participants received a link to a copy of that article from a number of years ago about the need to revise and create a 9th edition of the Model City Charter. And Derek provided a bit of an overview of that 2021 result. And there's really great recommendations for both traditional engagement institutions and newer forms, such as digital engagement. And I think we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. But I think that, the easiest strategy is to utilize citizen advisory bodies that, can be venues for dialogue and deliberation, because most local governments already have at least one in their existing charter. So it's not sort of a radical divergence, it's not something earth-shattering to just make adjustments to how that body is able to function. A lot of them, most municipalities and some counties have some sort of land use or zoning board, for example. So generally, the difficulty with these commissions and boards is that they operate really formalistically. They function like little mini city councils or county commissions. And so, they're offering very limited input via brief serial monologues, basically, either presentations or comments. And so to help them fulfill the aims that we're looking for, robust engagement means dialogue and deliberation, interaction among stakeholders. Generally, we have to operate that way outside of the formal legal procedure. And so we're kind of looking at the easiest way to adjust how a citizen advisory body might function is to separate dialogue and deliberation from decision. And even if they're not empowered with a final decision, they might have the authority to make a decision of what recommendation is going to the legislative body. So really easy, straightforward way to bring that robust engagement in is to have secondary or preliminary opportunities for facilitated dialogue and deliberation. And that way they're not breaking state or local transparency laws. Probably most of the folks here, have heard of sunshine laws, things that really keep the decision inside the legislatively authorized procedure. So, that's pretty much what that, I think, article was calling for, and what the 9th edition of the charter suggests is we can add other opportunities for those boards to bring stakeholders together. And if it's kept away from the decision making, then you can even have the elected officials involved. You can have expert administrators involved. You can have the residents who are most affected by the issue involved, other stakeholders, because it's not entering into that legalistic procedure. So in terms of the substantive content, I don't think it's been, 2021 is already a long time ago. I don't remember if we made recommendations of the types of issues that advisory bodies could be created for in the charter. But I think it's really important to have an advisory body for every primary power that a local government holds. And that's going to be different, from state to state. But things like the charter formation and change is an important power or authority, budgeting, land use control, law enforcement. There's other, critical issues around public works planning and social services. So if the more advisory bodies they have, a local government has to address these different areas of authority that they hold, the greater the democratic process. So that's what I would like to see in my dream charter.
And I think part of what you're all describing is that in the way you get people in the community and government officials and staff talking about the charter, you're demonstrating various kinds of good public engagement, which could also be included in the charter. They're kind of informing the recommendations that the commission might actually make. So just to kind of run through those, just to keeping a running score here. So Anna, you talked about kind of getting the whole community understanding what the charter is. Why, and it's true, charters are not well known. Most people don't realize their city or town has one at all. Even people within government often kind of treat them like part of the woodwork, nothing very exciting. But they, in fact, are a pretty important lever for change. The charter is a constitution for your city or town. Talk about it that way. Talk about it as a way of improving, local democracy. Let's get people talking about what we could do differently. So there's that kind of overall appeal and education effort that seems really important. Then there's the different avenues that you have, the charter, the commissions and boards, various kinds of groups that the city listens to, not only kind of asking them for their kind of feedback on charter revision, but also equipping them to engage more of their constituencies, which they're not always that good at, but giving them some basic, simple modules for good engagement so that they can bring back some of those ideas to the Charter Commission. The official public meetings of city council, school boards, other sorts of things, which in most cases are pretty, traditional 3 minutes at the mic sorts of things. They're the kinds of things you might want to change through a charter. And so perhaps try a different format, in the lead up as part of the charter, discussing the charter revisions, and use some of the sorts of things that you all have been talking about. And then also finding ways to reach the larger public. So one's in the chat, Scott, you asked about town halls and what role they should play. I mean, town hall as a term, of course, as you know, is sometimes used to describe the worst forms of engagement, completely unstructured or badly structured. And of course, they can also be really good. So I assume we're talking about the good kind, things that are structured, deliberative, that perhaps use digital tools to get the kind of sense of the crowd, those sorts of things. I think having something like that at the beginning of a charter revision process and then another one at the end. So the beginning one is part of the education process, so people understand what the charter is all about and how they can contribute to the whole discussion. And then it's something at the end where the commission is reporting, the charter revision commission is reporting on some of the things that it's discovered and things that might want to recommend. So beginning at the end for that. And then certainly digital forms. I mean, give people different tiers. And some people are never going to have time to come to a meeting or a town hall or whatever, but they will, spend, half an hour at the computer, rank some ideas, look at something, chat with their neighbors. I mean, there's a bunch of all kinds of digital tools, and none of these things by itself is the magic, answer, but the combination of these different approaches, adds a whole lot of both scale and depth, to the conversation. And that's also important because even when you have a mini public, one of these assemblies, that the mini public is very important because they can spend more time, get more information, talk more to officials and staff. They can really handle some very difficult choices in a charter or some other sort of issue, but they all still need a maxi public. Many publics work best when lots of other people know about them, can contribute some ideas to them, can answer surveys from them, can know about the recommendations they're making. So having these different tiers, which will allow you not to, to reach at least a small set of people in a really in-depth way, but a much larger set of people in a less, a more convenient way, in a more scalable way. That sort of a thing seems like will be important for a charter revision process, and that could also produce changes in the charter, which then go on to support those forms of engagement going forward.
Matt, there was something that you mentioned that reminded me of a practice that the city of Tempe, Arizona use. And we think that city councils can only convene to make decisions, to convene as a legislative body. But in Tempe, we used to hold issue review sessions that were just like a citizen advisory body, bringing stakeholders together, experts, they could be educative, they could be, dialogue and deliberation to try to come to some consensus recommendations. And so, it can be boards and commissions doing this, and it can even be a city council or county commission.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we're going to, I'm noticing a few comments in the chat, and we're definitely going to get to Anna really shortly. But just a quick note as well, that in addition to the existing infrastructure, let's also think about new infrastructure, participatory budgeting, standing citizens assemblies, civic audits, different ways to, why not have digital engagement embedded in the charter. These are all interesting things. And there's a lot of stuff written on different ways that sorts of democracy innovations. But let's turn to, the sort of political and community considerations for advancing civic participation in a charter. So what are the effective ways to get community buy-in, garner support? What are things to try and avoid to get the sort of inclusion of civic engagement so that it passes legislation? And so maybe, Anna, you might want to step in here and talk about your experience with Cambridge, Massachusetts. Talk a little bit about your process there and what the recommendations were and how that sort of followed through, and any thoughts you have on that process.
Yeah, of course. I think Cambridge struggled with what a lot has already been talked about here in terms of, within their own process, trying to engage more of the community, let people know that the charter review process was even happening, why charters were important for everyday residents in Cambridge. And so in kind of that internal discussion about how better to engage people in their process, it kind of led to a broader conversation about how do we make the overall city functions and processes more participatory and create structures that allow for more people who maybe aren't typically the ones attending public hearings or submitting public comment at city council meetings to be more engaged. And they also had kind of identified the dynamic and Cambridge has a city manager, city council structure, and some of the challenges that city council and the city manager were facing with just kind of their working together process. And so in doing their research, they identified they went with recommending a resident assembly to be inclusive of all the members in Cambridge, and really thought about it as something that could tackle some of the really tangible type issues that people in Cambridge would be able to connect with more easily. So things that might be like infrastructure or how to revitalize certain commercial districts, or just key decisions about the school system. And it would be something that the city council would choose a topic each term. They would create a resident assembly for a certain period of time. Maybe they would meet over 6 Saturdays for 6 months or something like that. And this group of randomly selected residents, who ideally would be representative of Cambridge, would discuss that topic and make a recommendation. I think one thing that was mentioned earlier is kind of like, how do you think about incorporating these new innovative structures into a charter? And one thing that the committee was really trying to be thoughtful about was that this would be a brand new process for Cambridge. There isn't a perfect model for how do you make sure these people are selected? What do you make sure they need? How should the process be run? So they tried to create some flexibility in the charter language that they created in the first place, because they knew that, they were going to pilot this program for the first time, and there would definitely need to be changes made for how those people were selected, how they advertised and educated, what types of things were needed, or how often the assembly would convene. And so those are some of the considerations that they took into account. But happy to answer any other questions if people have specific things.
Oops. And the process, we're going to jump to Q&A right now. Talk a little bit about the post process and how that unfolded, and some things, how that happened.
After the recommendation?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the Cambridge committee was a committee convened by the city council. They had made one recent change to the charter review committee, the charter, that was going to require a charter review every 10 years. And so this was the first one. The Cambridge charter hadn't been reviewed in over 100 years. So there are a lot of really basic things to address. So these were recommendations that went to city council, who would then submit a special act to the state legislature. And the city council reviewed the recommendations and voted whether they wanted to continue discussing each of the recommendations or not. They ultimately actually decided to not move forward with the resident assembly at this time in the charter, although there is some community movement about creating signatures to form a charter commission that would be a separate process. And one thing I think that the committee considered, and I think about now, as you know, this didn't move forward, is what does, you know, the committee spent 2 years creating all of this work, doing all this really thorough research, trying to engage the community as much as possible. And then they submitted their report and they were forced to dissolve. And so, you know, what is that post process look like? How should the committee have maybe stayed more engaged in advocating for their recommendations, working with city council to, you know, talk about it more and move it forward and create that community buy-in after the final report was submitted. I think these are things that, you know, future groups should definitely consider as they're thinking about these more innovative approaches that maybe aren't as familiar to people, because that post education I think is really important as well.
That's excellent. So why don't we move to Q&A? We have a few here in the comments, and I'll open it up to the panel, I guess. I think here's a question here from Scott. Should the Charter Commission members be part of the question and answer process?
And when Scott, when you say question or answer process, is it in regards to the changes that are being proposed with the revision? Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I think they should be because they're the ones that vetted the issue. They talked about the alternatives and they came up with a response to the change. And so I think they are best suited to answer and provide the rationale as to why. Did you have a follow-up to that one?
I
Let's see, you're
see
muted there, Scott.
I see a question of what if they don't want to be part of it. You know, I think it's, you know, it really depends on the individual community and what the rules are around the board, if they're allowed to continue meeting, and people's individual time to continue working on it. You know, often they'll have spent already 18 or 24 months on this project, and so maybe they're not able to continue. But if they feel, you know, they have the motivation and they're excited to continue to advocate for their recommendations, I think it's an individual decision.
I think this also, though, speaks to the initiating procedure and the clarity that needs to be built into the charge of the commission. You know, if it's really informal, then you're going to have these kinds of inconsistencies and problems where people don't fully understand their responsibility. And you know, to get back to what you said earlier, Anna, it's like really part of this robust education that has to come before anybody embarks on this stuff. And it's from everything from what does your state even allow, right? Every state has its own rules for what form of government is even legal. And, you know, and then they might have restrictions on how the charter can or cannot be formulated and approved. I mean, it's like there is so much diversity in the 50 states and so much detail that potentially has to be understood before forming the charter review procedure, before knowing, you know, and clarifying what the tasks are and what those participants' roles are going to have to be. So, you know, I think really taking your time up front is kind of like any other deliberative process. Taking your time up front to nail down what all of these legalities are and what the charge of the body is going to be and the expectations are going to be is going to make for much better outcomes. And, you know, it's Anna, you went through it, so you know that there's a million points within that entire, you know, 2 or 3 year process where things can really go south if you don't have them laid out well, right?
Yeah, one of our
Exactly.
mottos is be willing to go slow to go fast.
Speaking of
Exactly.
that,
Our
what
motto.
what is the time frame? I'm just building off of that other question here in the chat here. What's the general time frame that these usually could be given to have a thorough process?
If
I'll-
you're including the upfront education part, I would say 2 years. Probably 6 months of education and 18 months of process. Derek, what's your experience been?
And my experience has been mainly just with cleanups. So it hasn't been anything real substantial. So yeah, and we were meeting probably every few weeks. And I would say every 2 or 3 weeks. And the first few meetings were extensively focused just on law, what the requirement was, and then also what a city charter was, and what their roles and responsibilities were, and then how we were going to go about the revision process. So, and then as far as with the cleanup, even then, it was probably 6 months minimum of regular meeting, to get through the whole charter. And that was just a 12-page charter.
And I think the one variable here is just how engaged the community is generally. I mean, if the community has lots of different ways that they've been using digital and in person to interact with constituents in various ways, and boards and commissions are doing well and things like that, the better that is, the faster you can move in terms of the more quickly communication is going to get out. People have a higher base of knowledge to begin with, all those sorts of things. But then, of course, obviously in other variables, the extent to which you're going to change it, or how much change are you going to be thinking about in the charter, and therefore how many things. And this also could be, I mean, in some communities, you may already know that it's a controversial question whether to have ward-based versus at-large council elections, for example, or city manager versus strong mayor form of government, or whatever. So there could be things like that okay, we're going to need to really take some time on this because people have strong opinions already. And that may extend it versus, as you were saying, Derek, things where those sorts of things aren't really as prominent.
As you know, with the last 2 minutes left here, I'm going to leave this to Rebecca to finish off here. I just want to thank everybody.
Thank you, everybody, so much for being on today's webinar. Thank you specifically to our wonderful speakers and panelists. We've been prepping for this for a while, and they took a lot of time out of their busy schedules to be with us, so appreciate you all. I'm also, hopefully you're seeing the screen share. I'm sharing everyone's email addresses here on the slide. So if your question did not get answered during the Q&A, please feel free to shoot Margaret, Anna, Nick, Derek, or Matt a question via these email addresses. We also, the National Civic League, that is, offers charter review assistance. So if you are beginning to undertake this process, we can, go from everywhere from just making sure you have a copy of the Model City Charter and giving you some guidance to actually being with you hand in hand to do that process. So happy to talk to people about what that would look like. And then last but not least, there's going to be a survey in your follow-up email, which will include the recording and the slides. And one of the questions we're going to ask you about is your level of interest in a charter revision school. I think the degree of questions and the range of questions suggests that there might be some interest in this. So this could be anywhere between a half day, a full day, maybe even 2 days school where we would either virtually, hybrid, or in person gather to kind of talk about the Model City Charter and how to do a process and more of these questions in depth. So we'll be asking you a little bit to give us a little bit of feedback and to gauge your interest in that post webinar survey. So please feel free, please do take a couple of minutes to complete that survey. All right, and with that, I will let you go. We are going to be having a webinar again next month. We're going to be joined by our friends at Local Policy Labs to be talking about how to embed and incorporate engagement into your environmental sustainability work. So feel free to please register for that. We have these webinars once a month towards the end of the month, so please stay tuned, and we'd love to see you again sometime. All right, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.